Agave utahensis Eborispina is in danger from threats like illegal poaching, legal but unsustainable and unethical wild collection, and climate change and habitat loss. And so Project Eborispina is my attempt to do what I can to help protect these amazing and beautiful plants out in habitat. So that's what we're talking about this week. I'm going to give an update onto my preparations and plans for Project Eborispina. With just about 3 weeks to go before I start my Project Eborispina, I wanted to come on here and give a quick update on how my preparations are going, what my plan is, etc. for Project Eborispina. I made an earlier video introducing Project Eborispina, and in that video I go into a whole bunch more detail on what it is, what the motivations are, what I hope to do, etc. And so if you haven't seen that video, definitely go watch that one. But just to give you a quick update to catch you up to speed if you haven't seen that video yet. Basically, the situation is that agave utahensis Eborispina, of all the taxa of agave utahensis, is the one that's probably the most vulnerable out in habitat to stuff like poaching and habitat loss and climate change. And there's a number of things that we can do to try to protect Eborispina. One is, as collectors, we can make sure we're only buying seed-grown agave utahensis Eborispina plants and not buying plants that have been dug up from the wild collected agave utahensis plants, whether they be legal but probably unethical or unsustainable, or whether or not they're actually in fact poached. But on a sort of wider scale, we can also think about regulations and legislation that we can pass and implement to protect agave utahensis Eborispina. One is sort of at the state level, right? In California, there have been laws to protect Dudleyas and Joshua trees. And so here in Nevada, where most Eborispina live, we can pass laws like that to try to protect Eborispina from over-collection, from poaching, etc. And then the other is at the international level. We can list Eborispina in a CITES appendix, which will provide some regulations and some oversight into its trade across international borders. But in order to be able to accomplish either one of those things, we have to have an understanding, or at least an estimation, of exactly how many agave utahensis Eborispina plants there are out in habitat, which is something that we just currently don't have. And that'll be useful both for, either passing a state law or getting it listed in a CITES appendix, but then also it'll provide a benchmark such that we know this is the number in 2024 of how many agave utahensis Eborispina plants existed. And if somebody goes out and does the same thing in 2025 or 2026 or sometime in the future, we'll be able to understand what's happening to the populations over time, or are the population sizes changing? So for me to be able to contribute to this effort, what I plan to do is to make a series of trips to every population of Eborispina that I can find in southern Nevada and conduct surveys, essentially sampling, not digging plants up, just counting them, the number of agave utahensis Eborispina plants in those habitats, and then I'll produce a report that'll detail, estimate total population sizes of agave utahensis Eborispina. So that's my Project Eborispina. I've been preparing for it for a couple of months now, and like I said, I just wanted to come on YouTube and give a quick update on how that's going. So the first thing I want to talk about is the sites that I've identified, right? I'm focusing on Southern Nevada, or Nevada sites specifically, because I'm a Nevadan and my goal is to, like I said, one of the two goals is to help potentially try to pass some sort of state level legislation to protect agave utahensis Eborispina here in Nevada. So I'm sticking to Nevada populations. And I have a list of sites, something like 9 or 10, and I'll describe some of them a little bit better, or sort of categories of them. But just understand that I'm probably not going to be publishing, at least publicly, the actual names or locations of these sites, only because, I'm trying to protect these plants from poaching, not put them on a bunch of poachers' radars. And so I'll be referring to them by pseudonyms, basically sites 1 through 10 or through 9, however many I end up visiting. And so of those 9 or 10 sites that I've identified, there are basically 3 buckets, 3 categories of them, and I'm prioritizing them based on those buckets. The first bucket is what I'm calling documented and confirmed. And when I say documented, what I mean is that they've been documented in some sort of academic resource, some sort of, usually it's something called a exicata, which is like a listing of collected specimens in herbarium collections, and you can find stuff like that in books like this. Seminal, I talk about this book all the time. Howard Scott Gentry's Agaves of Continental North America has a Exticate, which again is a list of herbarium collections in it, and that is, is a list of where agave utahensis Eborispina plants have been collected, and that goes back way back into the 40s and 50s and you know, the subsequent decades. And then there are other locations, you know, like the Cactus and Succulent Society Journal, where there have been articles. This is a great article written by Matt Maggio about a new population of Eborispina he found in California, but it lists some other locations. And so that's my, you know, those are the academic sources. When I say a plant location has been, a population has been documented, I'm saying that it's referred to in one of those sources. And then documented and confirmed, that first bucket. The second half of that confirmed is that either this is a really well-known location that a lot of experts have been to and says, yes, there are definitely Eborispina plants here, or I've personally been to this location already and I can personally confirm, yes, Eborispina plants are here. Because the problem with some of these documented locations is that back many decades ago, you know, there are a number of places listed in that documentation that I'm sort of dubious of, based on a number of things. One being just sort of the location. There are some spots that look like they're really far outside of what we mostly know as Eborispina habitat, that they're listed, you know, somebody collected it back in the 40s or whatever and said there's Eborispina here, and I'm not 100% sure. And so unless there is both documentation and I personally confirmed it, talked to somebody who knows what they're talking about and has personally confirmed it, then that goes into the second bucket. Those locations will go into the second bucket, which I'm calling documented and unconfirmed. Because again, not only am I dubious just on the location, whether or not there's even agave utahensis in some of these locations at all, we also have to remember that the difference between Eborispina and like Nevadensis, for instance, isn't super binary. It isn't really, really obvious to everybody who may go visit these places. In fact, if you go on something like the iNaturalist app and you look at some of the observations of Eborispina, the pictures listed on those observations are definitely not Eborispina. So a lot of the work that I'm doing when I go out into habitat is actually going to be, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, is actually going to be just checking, are these actually Eborispina plants or not? So that second bucket is going to contain a lot of the sites, the populations that are listed in the documentation, but either I'm dubious because of where they are, or I'm dubious that those plants are even Eborispina in the first place, and not just Nevadensis or, you know, regular agave utahensis. And then the third bucket, and this is the one that I'm actually probably the most excited about, is undocumented populations, undocumented and unconfirmed, basically. And what that means is that there are a number of locations. I spend a ton of time, you know, out in habitat. I spend a ton of time on Google Earth. I spend a ton of time on a bunch of different sort of mapping apps. And I've identified a few spots where there have never been, to my knowledge at least, formal documentation that there are agave utahensis Eborispina plants in that location. And I have not personally spoken to any experts, folks who would know the difference between Eborispina and Nevadensis, about there being Eborispina plants in that in that area. And so there's a few on the list that I'm really excited to go visit. I haven't been there yet, but if I were to go out there, then I would, and find Eborispina, I think that'll be super interesting because there hasn't been any other, you know, sort of formal observation of agave utahensis Eborispina plants in those locations. And the characteristics that I use, without giving away too much, because again, I'm trying to protect these plants from poachers, not put them on poachers' radars. The characteristics that I'm using to determine, to identify potential Eborispina locations is just their location. Is it within the boundaries of what we generally consider Eborispina habitat? Is it at the right elevation, right? Because agave utahensis only grows at certain elevations. Does it have the right geology, right? Because agave utahensis only likes to grow, doesn't only grow on specific substrates, like it doesn't only grow on limestone, it does sometimes grow also on sandstone, but it certainly prefers to grow on limestone. So is this area the right geology? And then does the slope, right, because these are generally all montane regions, you know, regions in mountains or ridgelines, does the slope face the right direction? Because the direction or the aspect of a slope determines how much sunlight it gets. And I've noticed in habitat, and I've talked about it here on the channel a few times, but in certain habitats, if you're on a ridgeline and say the one side of the ridgeline faces north and the other side faces south, you'll see a ton of plants on the south side and then none on the north side. So those are the four characteristics that I'm using to identify locations and then put them in that sort of undocumented and unconfirmed bucket. So the next thing I want to talk about is going to be my methodology, what I'm actually going to do when I get out into these populations. And because some of these populations aren't really well defined, either I haven't been there or they're undocumented entirely, one of the biggest questions that I'm going to have in my head that is going to determine how I can survey these populations, how I can actually count how many plants there are, is their boundaries, right? And so most of these are going to have unknown borders, right? I'm not going to know. There is no map where there's a circle, like there are plants inside the circle and no plants outside the circle. So one of the things I'm going to have to do is sort of estimate what the borders of the population are. And that is going to mean that I'm going to have to travel on foot quite a long distance to try to circumnavigate to some degree, at least visually, to see, okay, the plants end there basically, and then I'll mark that down in some geospatial software or note taking. And so border estimation is going to be a big thing, sort of just drawing rough borders, estimating rough borders around each population that I go visit. And then once I've done that, I've actually got a sample, i.e. survey. Again, sample kind of makes it sound like I'm digging plants up. I'm not. Sampling is just sort of statistical methodology because I'm not really going to be able to count every plant out in all of these habitats. I'm going to have to use a sampling methodology to count smaller sections of these populations and then extrapolate that information to estimate how many total plants there are. And I've sort of been circling between or debating between two rough methodologies. One is called transect sampling and the other one's called quadrant sampling. Quadrant sampling would be basically, if I had really well-defined borders for all these populations, I could just go in Google Earth or whatever other mapping software and cut it up into grids and then randomly select grids and then go out into the field and count how many plants there are in each one of these grids. Because I don't have really well-defined borders ahead of time, that's a little bit more difficult. So what I'm actually going to be doing is a version of something called transect or line intersect sampling, where when I get out to habitat, and I estimate the borders, I will then, in my mapping software, draw out a straight line across that border, several straight lines across that border, or across that boundary, across that population, and then at random intervals on that line, I will sample the number of plants that are in that area, right? Basically drawing a line and then putting quadrants, putting little squares on the line at various intervals on that line, and then counting the number of plants that occur in each one of those areas. So that's basically called transect sampling, not to get too nerdy on you guys, but I think that's going to be the way that I'm going to approach this. And if any of you guys are statistical nerds or environmental or ecological statistical nerds, and I'm saying something that's totally wrong or you have some other suggestions, I'm super all ears. Please reach out to me on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. The next thing that I'm going to be doing, and I alluded to this earlier in the video a little bit, is actually focusing on definitively identifying whether or not the plants that I'm visiting in these populations are actually Eborispina, right? Because a bunch of these locations are documented in the documentation, but I'm dubious that there are agave out there at all, and that the agave is in fact Eborispina, right? Because the Nevadensis to Eborispina is a spectrum. It's not a binary dead. So this is definitely Eborispina or this is definitely Nevadensis. There are some plants that are kind of in the middle. And even amongst experts online, and folks who sell agave utahensis, there is some disagreement. There are definitely a ton of plants online that are listed as Eborispina that are clearly not Eborispina. And as I mentioned, even if you go on an app like iNaturalist, and you look at the observations that are listed as agave utahensis Eborispina, and you look at the photos, those are definitely not Eborispina. So I've talked about in my video previously about identifying Eborispina, how I identify Eborispina, and it's basically all terminal spine length. And that's based on all of the descriptions in the formal literature, going back again to the 40s and all the way up through the 2000s. It's the spine length. Over 4 inches is Eborispina. Under 4 inches is not Eborispina. Essentially, is how I'm going to attribute this. And then the fourth thing that I'm going to be doing out in population when I'm visiting these populations is recording photographically and on video the forms. Because again, and I talked about this a little bit in my taxonomy video, and I talked about this some with Kelly Griffin, legendary agave breeder. Each individual population off of agave utahensis lives in Sky Island, so they're really isolated from the other populations, and so a lot of them have really unique forms. And so what his suggestion is, and what some other folks have also suggested, is that potentially some of these populations may include unique forms that are either a form or variety of Eborispina, and recent taxonomy has elevated Eborispina to a subspecies, so there could be varieties underneath that now, and then forms underneath that. But are there specific forms of agave utahensis Eborispina? Are there other subspecies of agave utahensis, somewhere between, roughly between Eborispina and nevadensis, that need to be described as their own taxa? Now, this isn't the primary focus of Project Eborispina, but I do think it would be a pretty fun, little side project, little side quest to do while I'm out there. And I'm a big photography nerd, and I'm planning to take a bunch of photos, videos anyway. So that'll be the sort of fourth thing that I'll be doing, is trying to identify, are there populations that have unique forms that deserve to be sort of named themselves as their own, varieties, subspecies, or forms of agave utahensis. And the last thing I want to talk about is my preparations in terms of my physical preparation. So as I said, I'm beginning this series of essentially hikes, long distance hikes, in about 3 weeks. Hopefully temperatures, it's been a very, very hot summer, and it's still, over 100 degrees outside right now. And so hopefully in 3 weeks, the temperatures will decrease. And I want to get these hikes all done within 2 or 3 weeks, essentially. So that'll be something like 3 hikes a week, somewhere in that range, 2 to 3 hikes a week. A lot of these hikes are going to be not only very long, they're also going to be largely off trail. They're going to be in pretty technical terrain, lots of rocks. And then they're also going to involve a lot of elevation change. It's going to be a lot of climbing up the side of basically mountains or large hills. And in order to be able to sample, to survey enough of the population to be able to, estimate the boundaries of that population and to get a statistically defensible sample size, I'm gonna need to cover quite a lot of ground. And I don't wanna be out there for days and days and days in each one of these populations, because I have 9 or 10 of them to do over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. So I've spent a bunch of time over the last couple of months preparing myself physically for this this endeavor, right? I have spent a bunch of time, and I've talked about this before, but I've spent a bunch of time out in the desert, in the Mojave, running and hiking and rock climbing and off-road driving and all this kind of stuff. But recently I hadn't done so much of it, after the lockdown, I hadn't been getting out as much as I was previously. So I spent some time, like I said, over the last couple of months, getting myself back into the physical condition necessary to accomplish this goal in a reasonable amount of time, to be able to cover the kind of terrain that I need to in a reasonable amount of time. And what that's basically boiled down to is one, a bunch of sort of fat loss. The smaller you are, the lighter you are, the faster you can move in habitat. And so I've lost over the last 10 weeks or so, I posted about this on my Instagram, but I've lost about 20 pounds, which is certainly making me feel a lot lighter and faster and more spry. I've also started running quite a bit out in habitat on technical terrain, getting my lower legs and feet ready, just to take the rocks and stuff, and then getting my cardiovascular system up to snuff. And then I've also included, because again, I'm going to be carrying a pack with my tripod, my camera, a bunch of water, first aid supplies, all that kind of stuff, into these environments. And so I've also begun incorporating weighted carries. Again, I posted about this too, but basically putting a weighted backpack on and going to the gym and climbing on the treadmill, or not the treadmill, but the step mill, the Stairmaster, the Ellis escalator at the gym thing, for quite a while. And that is a sort of a painful but very productive workout. And the methodology that I'm using is actually coming from this book. If you're at all interested in doing expeditions to habitat, particularly if it's like a cactus or succulent habitat where there's a lot of vertical climbing, I cannot recommend this book and the folks who wrote it enough. Basically, this is a manual for how to train for mountainous environments, either racing or even just expeditions. And the guys who wrote it have trained a bunch of folks who go on a ton of different mountainous expeditions. So that's the sort of methodology that I've been using to get myself ready for these trips. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What are you most excited about Project Eborispina? And thanks for watching.